One of the things that we'll see when we'll go through Luke's gospel, probably in the second half of the year, is that Matthew and Luke present relatively different stories of how Jesus was born. And I say relatively different because it looks very different in the beginning, but as we'll see, it's not that different after all. Now, if you remember, Matthew started us off in Bethlehem. He says that's where Jesus was born, and after he was born, he was visited by the Magi, and they were guided by a star. And then King Herod sought after his life, after Jesus' life, and that's why they had to flee to Egypt. And then, as they wanted to return from Egypt to Bethlehem, they still were afraid because of Herod's son who was ruling there, and so they then moved to Nazareth. This is the story that Matthew gives us, and the story that Luke tells us is that Jesus' father Joseph actually came from Nazareth. So he was out of Nazareth. This is where he also found his bride, Mary. And then he was called to a census. And because of that census, he had to go to Bethlehem, which was his hometown, probably where he was born before and where his family is. Then from there on, Jesus was visited by the shepherds, and they had angelic visions, and after that has passed, they are all returning to Nazareth. Now, as you see, those are two very different stories that are being told here. And the reason for that is that they both present a very different Jesus. Some people struggle with the idea that there are two different stories around of how Jesus was born, because they feel that at least one of them must be true, and then the other one wrong, or possibly even both wrong, because if they contradict each other, it's impossible for both of them to be simultaneously true. There are some scholars who think that they can be harmonized. In other words, that you can combine both stories and they will still fit. So, for example, just because Matthew starts out in Bethlehem doesn't mean that Joseph may not have been from Nazareth. Why not? And that there was a census and that's how he came to Bethlehem. Just because Matthew doesn't tell us doesn't mean it didn't happen. Or just because Jesus was visited by Magi doesn't mean that there weren't also shepherds. And just because there was a star, that doesn't mean there was an angelic vision to the shepherds involved. And just because Luke says that they went straight back to Nazareth, it doesn't mean that they went via Egypt, as Matthew informs us. So there are people who think that it can be harmonized, most notably, I think, Mark Robertson. But others disagree with that, and here, as some would guess, people from the Jesus seminar in particular, Marcus Borg, and also scholars like E.P. Sanders, who would rather say things like the birth stories of Jesus are complete fiction, and those are just myths, and the gospel writers did their best trying to collect those stories, but they just didn't know any better, and we shouldn't take those too seriously. Now, in response to all of that, I think I just want to say three quick things. Now, the first one is that I do think they can be harmonized to a certain degree, but even if they couldn't be, I just want to say that I don't think it's that important. I think it's a secondary issue. Not because I don't think that it historically happened, but because I've tried my hardest in those videos to bring out the fact that Matthew is really trying to tell us a very deep and founded, deeply rooted Jewish story of Jesus, and that is his agenda. Luke is giving us a very different story. He's telling us not of the rich people that come to worship Jesus, who is a descendant from David and hence has a right to the throne of Israel. But Luke tells us a story of the Jesus who from the beginning gathered shepherds and the lowest of the low around him. So both are presenting very different viewpoints of Jesus in the nativity story. But again, that doesn't mean that both can't be true. if you think of any kind of object, let's just say a human being here, and you take two shots at that person with a camera, say one from above here and one from here, you have a difference in 90% as far as the degree is concerned, but the object will appear completely different. If you take from up here, you will have a completely different background, you will have a completely different shape. If you take a shot right from the front, you will have again different background here and different forms and elements. And you would look at both those pictures and say it's impossible for those to be the same thing, the same object, but actually they are. They're just taken from a different point of view. And the same, I think, is true for Matthew, who again portrays Jesus' royal line and his claim to the throne, and Luke, who portrays Jesus' human side and his the inclusiveness of his ministry. And the second thing, or third thing rather, I wanted to say is that historically speaking, from a historian or even just from a detective point of view, if there are discrepancies in two stories of the same event, it doesn't mean that this event didn't happen. As a matter of fact, it makes it even more likely that the event has happened. If both stories were exactly the same, the conclusion would simply be that they copied each other, or that there was one source from which they both copied. But the fact that we have two relatively different stories with very different focuses makes it very clear that those two stories are independent of each other, and that increases the historical likelihood that they are true. One example here is the Titanic in 1912. As most of us will know, the Titanic crashed an iceberg. Now, when that happened, there were the survivors went back to who made it to the mainland, were asked what has happened, and some of them swore that the Titanic hit an iceberg and then cracked in two. And others swore that no, it just hit the iceberg and then sank immediately. Now again, both stories can't be true. One thing must have happened and not the other. But just because both eyewitnesses, both groups of people that were involved in the accident, just because they didn't give a coherent report, didn't lead anyone to conclude that the Titanic never existed. Quite the opposite. That made it very clear that something dramatic has happened here, and that what they say is true, even though it may seem difficult to harmonize it at first. And I think exactly the same is going on in the two gospel nativity stories.